Welcome to today's Grant Masterclass. For any of our first timers, Instrumentl is the most loved all in one grants platform for prospecting, tracking, and management. And we currently help 4,000 nonprofits and grant consultants save time in finding and applying for more grants. Today, we're joined by federal compliance and grant lifecycle expert Rachel Werner from RBW Strategy. Many of you attended our workshop with Rachel last Thursday about finding and evaluating federal grant opportunities in 2025 under the new administration. Today's event is going to dive into the next stage, which is grant compliance and everything you need to know to, remain compliant in good standing with your grant maker and the terms of the grant you've been awarded. If you missed Thursday's event, don't worry, you can still watch a replay, but you will be able to follow along with today's content just fine without that context too. Some quick FYIs about this event. It is about an hour long, and as we move through the presentation, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat box. I will try to answer them there, or I'll bring them up to Rachel to address during our Q&A at the end. This is being recorded. You'll get the information on how to access the recording tomorrow via email. And I know we're all busy, we're working hard, there's a lot happening with our grant portfolios, so thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. If you need to step away at any point, please feel free to do so. We will be right here, but I do want you to stick around till the end because we'll be sharing a special Instrumentl offer with those of you who didn't already receive it at Thursday's workshop. And we have two helpful reports to share. These are going to outline agency-specific updates and what the status is on grants being issued by each federal agency, as well as an overview of the state of federal funding and a really helpful trigger words list. You all really benefited from seeing this list last time. We'll be sure to share it with you all again. You'll get those at the end of the webinar. And before we dive in, I just want to introduce myself for any of our first timers. I'm Nia. I am an events and community manager here at Instrumentl, and my job is to develop helpful and educational events like this one to share with our Instrumentl community. I actually come from the nonprofit world, so prior to this, I worked in rainforest conservation and research. But I am not the expert in the room today, and with that, I want to introduce Rachel Werner. Rachel started her career as a New York City public school teacher, which parlayed into a 2-decade work career in the public sector. She served as a grant writer for a community-based hospital, a fundraiser for a human services organization, and a grants manager at an education management organization. She now serves as the owner and CEO of RBW Strategy, a grants consulting firm in the Metro DC area. And Rachel and her team at RBW Strategy have actually raised over $240 million and managed over $2.5 billion in federal grant awards. She's also a principal at MyFedTrainer, offering compliance training to folks about the complexities of federal grant awards. And they've trained thousands of people since their inception in 2010. So you can see why Rachel is the perfect person to be leading this workshop for us here. We are really grateful to have Rachel here for the third time already this quarter with our Instrumentl events folks to talk about all things federal funding, provide some much needed guidance. Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much again for your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Nia. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you again for those who participated last week or perhaps the other session, which seems like a year ago, but it was only a month ago, to talk about the changes that were happening in the federal agency space. So suddenly grant compliance has become quite a hot topic. People are now really interested in it. And before I would really have to try to educate people, what exactly is grant compliance? Why is it important? What's 2 CFR 200? And so now I can actually, talk about it a little bit more specifically because of the fact that we need to do this more, and it's become a required, it's always been a required component, but now it's more important now than ever. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and you should see the slides now. What we're really going to talk about is building your grant compliance team. And we're going to go through, what does this mean? Why is it important? Because I say that we talk about a culture of philanthropy. We need to talk about a culture of compliance, because now safeguarding, maintaining your grant funding is going to be top of mind and is so, so vastly important. And so we're just going to kind of go through a little bit. I'm going to leave some room for questions. Happy to answer anything because I always want to leave some time for that. So here's my bio. I know that Nia spoke about it, so I'm just going to quickly skip through. So, what do we want to talk about today? We're going to talk about the considerations that you want to think about before you even put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard when you're applying for grant funding. You want to think about these things as I always say, from the post award mindset during the pre award. What are some considerations in building your culture of compliance? We're going to talk about a step-by-step action plan. So going through what are the 5 steps for administering grants and building that culture of compliance. And we're going to review some common pitfalls and challenges. And this is where I'd really love to get some of your feedback, because these are some of the things that we get pushback on about why is compliance important. So let's talk about the pre-award side. So here is an overview of the grant life cycle. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this, but something I want to point out is that, when people really think about grants, they really focus on that application development phase, which is phase 2. That is when you're actually putting together the application, you're gathering your letters of support, you're gathering your budget information, you're putting it all together, submitting it through the application portals. I think that the most important phase is actually the first phase, research and strategic planning, because that is where you can really figure out, do we have the right funders? Do we have the resources in place? Do we have the ability to take this on? Do we have to think about all these different considerations? This is when you could do sort of a risk assessment to see where you are as an organization or with your programs and coming together like that. So that is where I think you can make really critical decisions, and we can also plan for the post-award side as well. And the other piece that I think is also critically important is award management and monitoring. How are you actually being a good steward of those funds that were entrusted in you? How are you actually delivering on the promises that you said you were going to do this specific work? What are you actually doing to showcase the funders' priorities, and that's reflected in the work that you do? So just to think about that in a different way in terms of, the grant life cycle and the different work that goes into it. So before you even apply, sort of part of this go, no go assessment, should we go after funding? What does it make sense for our organization? So these are just some things to consider. So I mentioned before risk. Risk is a big part of whether or not you want to pursue funding. And, if you were participating the last time, I kind of talked about risk assessment and thinking about, what are some sort of areas of risk that you want to highlight. It could be strategic risk, risk to your strategic priorities, financial risk, reputational risks. There's a lot of different areas. And so if you're going to go after some funding, what could really threaten the project and what could also threaten the organization? And so having an understanding of some of those areas can help you develop mitigation strategies and better ways to address them so they aren't going to be a surprise. Right now, a risk is, well, this is an open opportunity, but will it remain open or will it close? So is it worth our time to pursue now? So just something to think about, especially in light of all the changes happening in the federal sector. Also, capacity and partnership. What is the work that your team can handle? What happens externally that can provide support to you? Can you partner with some on this engagement? And so those are the kind of things that you want to think about, whether or not you're going to keep it all internally, whether you're going to be working with other partners, and what does that partner structure look like? So, and when you bring in external partners, that's where it could be areas of risk because the work is happening outside of your organization. And how are you monitoring them? So from a program analysis standpoint, this is when we talk about things like the performance measurements. How are you evaluating that program's success? And what are the metrics that you're using to measure that success? And what happens if there's additional growth? What if there's additional changes? So how is that going to impact your organization? Because what we don't want to have is a situation where you have to modify your programs to get that funding. So what are you going to do to ensure that you stay true to the principles and the priorities that your programs have so you can continue operating in the manner that you have said that you were going to do? And then, of course, the sustainability. How are you going to continue providing support if the funding ends? And in thinking through that in different ways, it's not just we're just going to apply for more grant funding. It's also, well, how could you make this part of your operating budget? How can you start thinking through with other partners and leverage services? Could there be a fee for service model? And there's other ways to kind of think about it. And there are other different types of revenue sources that you could enhance if the government grant goes away. And so what is that part of your sustainability? Because what you don't want to have happen is you get a big award and then it becomes a successful program and then you can't sustain it, because we all don't want to see that happen. So what are some of the changes that are happening? I provided an overview before, but I'll just kind of highlight some of the things. There's a lot more scrutiny in the grant process. So in addition to just obviously the changes that are happening in the federal sector, there's a lot more focus on the specific awards and adhering to the terms and condition and adhering to the executive orders and ensuring that there's an alignment there. So there's more scrutiny on the process and about how funding is administered. So being able to account for that as part of the process now is something, and why compliance is so critical. Also, nonprofits are getting a lot of backlash in terms of, well, we need to have more oversight over them. There has to be a level of transparency with how the funds are being spent. So there's a lot more focus, and this isn't just for nonprofits, but also with government contractors in general, which are other companies and other entities that receive billions of dollars in federal contracts. But there's a lot more scrutiny. And there's a lot more of a need to justify and account for how funds are spent and the work that's being done. And how are you measuring that? How are you addressing that as an organization? And also the risk portfolios. So how are you conducting risk assessment? So if there's partnerships with recipients, with subrecipients or contractors, what are you doing to add to those terms and conditions if there are some sort of high risk potential partners, to maintain a level of accountability and oversight that they're doing the work that they said they were going to do in that agreed upon scope of work. Also, the procurement requirements are more focused on American-made products. So this is particularly focused on things like construction or acquisition, of goods and services that are, maintaining it in the U.S. And also, in terms of information sharing, just how are you communicating with your team? And this is something that I'm going to talk about in the next section, of just ensuring that people have access to the same level of information, that there's some knowledge sharing going on so people understand some of these updates and can incorporate them as needed. So we're going to talk about the funding opportunity announcement. We're going to go through one and look at it from three different lenses. So one is the programmatic lens. So that is, what is the evaluation structure? What is the planning or potential outreach that's needed? From financial, of course, let's talk about the funding. Are there any specific budget caps? How will funds be tracked? Time and effort reporting, because that's needed for for staff that spend their time paid out of grant funding, and just things like allowable costs, and how are those going to be calculated and tracked. And then from an operations perspective, the reporting expectations, communicating with the federal or other agency to ensure that those administrative requirements are met, and how is that being managed. Usually that can be sort of a project manager role. So I'm going to give you an example of a funding opportunity announcement, or notice of funding opportunity. They're all kind of the same thing, just called different names. The Department of Health and Human Services Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is a sample funding opportunity announcement. And what I did was I took that table of content and I try to highlight those areas that if you were going to think about, well, how are we going to manage this award? How are we going to ensure that we are good stewards of federal funding? You want to look at these specific areas, and there's going to be some differences between the different opportunity announcements, but these are just some things that I wanted to highlight. So first, of course, when we talk about programmatic, data collection performance measurement. They're going to be asking you, well, here's the information we want you to gather. And are you working with your program team to ensure that they can gather this information and they can provide the relevant data that's needed to meet the expectations as highlighted here in the funding opportunity announcement. Then when we get to eligibility, we get to the cost sharing and matching. Now it's just called cost share, and that is a big part of financial. So is there a cost share requirement that's needed? And if so, what exactly is it going to be that you are using as part of your cost share? Is it state funding? Is it other private philanthropic dollars? What is it that you're using to cost share to show that you have some support that you are putting towards this project as well? And also, another part of the budget are things like funding limitations or restrictions. Are there certain caps? You know, you can't spend more than 20% of this budget on equipment. And there are specific cost categories. So just making sure that you're aware of what is allowable and not allowable for this particular opportunity. And then we get to the last part, which is operations, which is the Federal Award Administration. So giving you the information on here's the national policy requirements that you need to adhere to, here's reporting requirements, and here's, you know, the federal award notices, just so that you can see, you know, what the terms and conditions are. So this just gives you an overview of things you can look at, because a lot of times those sections are skimmed over because you're just thinking, well, here's the word count, here's, you know, the character limits or what have you, this is what we need to put in the application, but not about what happens next. So this is why I say become a grant detective, so that you can be aware of how you can service your organization or clients. And this is why compliance is critical. And I say this quite a bit, because if you are not compliant, that could mean disallowed costs, which would be an expense for the organization. You could have audit findings with required corrective actions that need to address those deficiencies. You could become debarred or suspended and unable to receive federal grants for a period of time. There could be legal consequences if there's information that is inaccurate and you're falsifying or embellishing information, even if it may not have been something that you'd planned to do. It's an oversight. You're still responsible. What you put down has to be truthful. And of course, there's a reputation loss, you know, the damage that could be done if you're not responsible with the grant funding. You know, you don't want to end up in a situation like that. I had a client that was in the Washington Post, and it was not pretty. It took them a long time to turn that around. So I'm going to ask this question, and then I'll see if there's any questions in the chat. Your finance director approved a budget and did not include the program director with reviewing it during the application phase. Now it's post-award, and the program director is confused by the anticipated expenses. How can we address this situation now and avoid this in the future? I don't know if you've had that happen, but it's happened to me a few times. So what can you do to try to foster that relationship and address this so that you don't have always include finance in the pre-award process? Yep. Yeah, feel free to share your thoughts. Hold meeting before applying. Yep, definitely always have a meeting. Communication is key. Yep. And I think you need to have the blessing of the program folks, and also finance. So if there's a budget that it has to be blessed by your finance team. Yep. Yep, exactly. So it's really important. I think all of this just relates to just having good communication, and also having this codified in some kind of policy or process, you know, that might be helpful too, so that there's clarity on the roles and how they're all involved. So before I move on, I just wanted to see if there's any questions, Nia.
Sorry, took a while to come off mute.
Oh, no,
Not yet. I have a couple saved in the document, but I think I'll just bring them up at the end because they're not super relevant to this topic right here.
okay, perfect. All right, well then let's go on. All right, so part 2, setting the stage for compliance success. All right, so let's go through what that is. I love this because This culture of compliance, I think this is like the bread and butter. This is what we need to do to ensure that we are going to be successful in managing our funding. And I think this works for even if you don't have federal funding. So let's think about the Kipling method, which is just, the old style reporting of who, what, when, where, why, how. So we're going to talk about people and processes, maintenance and systems, knowledge and policies, and how they're all really important in putting together that sort of jigsaw puzzle in compliance. Because I think that sometimes people feel overwhelmed, like there's a lot of different things we must adhere to. So the goal that I want you to get out of this today is understanding, here are the things that you should be aware of. It doesn't mean you need to have them all set in place within your organization, but there is more of a critical eye and scrutiny. So by thinking through some of these in more detail, and we're going to go through some steps at the end, will be helpful to you. So why a culture of compliance? So this is your chance to create that sustainability during times of change. So if you can focus on repeatable, scalable systems, processes, roles, and things like that, it will help your organization continue to thrive. And it really allows you to weather different changes because you have systems in place. There are things that make sense that allow for these different kind of fluctuations because you have things that have been codified as an organization. And now, even if there's people that leave or if there's changes in your funding, that is something that you'll be better able to sustain. So people, we're going to talk about who manages. So there's multiple people involved in grant compliance. And I can't tell you, just sometimes like I have been on applications where you have 30 partners and you're just trying to figure out, do they all need to be involved? And one of the things that I say, and this people kind of mentioned this before in the chat, was start off with a really good kickoff meeting. Have all the people at the table who need to be there. Now, there's also that differentiation between maybe if you have 30 partners, do you need all of them there? Not necessarily, because you maybe want to designate a steering committee or perhaps a smaller representative group. And think about, the responsibilities for the core functional areas. And think about a RACI chart. Now, I'm going to go through what a RACI chart is. Now, I'm a project management professional. One of the processes is communications management. And this is something that I think is really beneficial to you. So this can be used in almost any different scenario if you're thinking about this for marketing or communications, but grants is a great way too. So let's say that you receive a federal grant or other large scale type of funding. You want to think about which of your stakeholders are responsible, they're actually doing the work, that are accountable, that are going to ensure that this happens, consulted, so maybe they're providing advisement support, or informed. They just need to know what's happening because your communication, which each one of those groups is probably going to differ. So for those who are responsible, they should be part of your weekly status meeting. But those who are informed, maybe they're just CC'd in an email. So this kind of helps you look at your different stakeholders that are involved and determine how can we actually have them included and aware of what's happening, but not necessarily in the same manner. So highly recommend using something like this. And now we're going to talk about processes. So what is needed? So this is getting more into the task management. So you have a project management plan, and that sometimes, people will use a cloud-based system that could be Asana. Other people might be using one that's like a Google Sheet. So it's really about assigning tasks. It's about ensuring that those different processes are addressed and that there's deadlines included, especially looking at the notice of award, there's reporting deadlines and other things. And you just want to think about what it is that you want to include and continually be updating and how often you're going to meet and that type of thing. So, in thinking about maintenance, when does this need to happen? Well, first of all, I always say start with the notice of funding opportunity and the notice of award or contract. Taking a look at those documents will help you see, what is it that we need to plan for? Because you want to think about the deadlines. when does the agency, or if it's a PTE or pass-through entity, which could be a state or local government agency or another type of entity that is the pass-through of that federal funding, when do they need to be informed? And what are the reporting requirements? So, this is kind of can be built into that project plan, but it allows you to plan ahead and say, well, we're an organization that maybe you're all working virtually and you want to find a time to meet. Maybe meeting weekly can be a bit of a challenge, but how are you going to continue to make updates and move forward? And so you have to find that happy medium. Is it going to be sort of virtual updates? Are you going to be basing it on what those deliverables are? Are you going to kind of meet in different intervals depending on whether there are things that you need to develop or deliverables that you need to put together? So, that can kind of help set the tone for how often and who should be at the table. And, I mentioned this before about manual versus systems. I don't know how many times people have asked me, what's the best project management system to use? My response is always, it depends, because you need to know your user requirements. The system that you use has to meet the needs that you have. And I suggest that if you use a project management system, that it has to be something maybe that you start off with just one project, pilot it, and see if that could be adapted. Or if you already have a system in place, use that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you're using a grant specific system, if you do get a lot of grant funding, you can use a system. I know Instrumentl has a system that you can use to track those different deliverables and post-award type of work. Then make sure that that's something that's going to be used by multiple parties, because that is the great part of it, instead of just having one person. If you do something manual, which might be preferred, again, there's no right or wrong, it's just what works. You can use Teams or Google, whatever kind of system makes the most sense. People, might have other ways that they share information. The only thing about those is that there could be some version control issues. So you need to just kind of check to see who's making the updates and when, and if multiple people are involved, you need to have some kind of rules on sort of managing that, or just have one person. So just think about, what might be best. I mean, I know that I work with a bunch of people who might not be as technologically savvy, so just be mindful of that. And then we go with knowledge. So why? Why is it important to stay informed? Well, we know that there's so many changes. So knowledge is power. Knowledge allows you to, at least, even if you don't know the response that you should give, you could at least know enough to avoid sticky situations where you could put yourself in a vulnerable place. And in thinking about 2 CFR 200, that is the Uniform Grant Guidance. That is the document that outlines all the requirements for how federal funding recipients, subrecipients, contractors must adhere regarding federal funding. And those are going to probably be updated with the latest administration. There were just some recent updates in October, but with some of the recent changes that have been made, the guidance might be updated. So just be aware of that. National Grant Management Association is having their conference next week, so we'll see. There might be some things that come out of that that could be helpful to know. And this also just helps you with sort of project planning and, making you aware of the different requirements to things in your policies that you want to consider updating, especially for those that might impact you more than others. So how do you follow the plan? Policies and processes. So internal controls is something that I speak a lot about, and I'll be actually speaking about it at the National Grant Management Association. And the written form of that is your policies. So your policies and procedures manual, it outlines, these are what the different requirements are, and this just shows you how we're adhering to them as part of the Uniform Grant Guidance requirements. So what do you have in place to showcase your capacity? And I'm going to go an overview here. Well, what are those specific policies? So this is sort of a broad overview. You have the ethics part of it, which is your whistleblower policy. There could be, actions arising from fraud investigations, safeguards for employees. So this is more of the ethical side. Then you have the general oversight, which is reporting structure. time and effort reporting is a big one because a lot of funds are spent on staffing. And I'm going through these pretty quickly, but each one could kind of go into more depth. Performance reviews, adherence to national policy requirements such as lobbying, drug-free workplaces, and single audit preparation and management. From the program management, you have things like code of conduct, which is also known as conflict of interest, which is really critical if you do a lot of procurements and you want to avoid any of those situations where there could be a conflict. And subrecipient monitoring, grant budget tracking, and then of course, when you have financial management, it goes through all of these different areas. Most people think internal controls are just finance, but it kind of covers the organization and how you administer those grant funds. So you have things like procurement, equipment management, indirect cost rate agreement, travel policy. So some might be more relevant than others. And this is why looking at your notice of grant award is really important so that you can make sense of, which ones are most applicable to you. And now I'm going to pause here to see if there's any other questions before we move on.
Yeah, we actually do have some questions. I can split it between our Q&A and right now. Let me pull
Okay.
up the ones. Speaking of compliance and that post-award piece, one of the questions we just had was, do you have any recommendations for conferences?
For conferences. Oh, you meaning attending conferences? I
Yeah,
thought
for
like
attending a conference where we can learn more about this or connect with other people who are sharing about this or learning about this.
National Grant Management Association. Man, that is the place. That's the place. Grant Professional Association too. They are starting to build out more post-award side. So their conference is going to be at the end of October, early November. But those are definitely good places that I would start there. And I know that NGMA has webinars on an ongoing basis. And there's also ones that, depending on what you're interested in, I've seen some with like law firms might be putting on webinars. I'm a member, I'm based in Maryland, so there is the Greater Washington Society of CPAs. So they have an arm that is focused a lot on, the impacts of federal funding. And that's from an accounting vantage. But again, there could be some things like that that might be beneficial. But I would definitely say those are the ones that I can think of top of mind that are specifically related to grants. But yeah.
That's helpful to know. Yeah, we definitely, from Instrumental's point of view, we definitely echo AGT, which is next week. And we actually just got a comment in the chat that registration cutoff is tomorrow. So if that's something that's of interest to you all, you have one day to go ahead and get in on that. And GPA Grant Summit for sure. We have a great time there, and it's just such a valuable event. Rachel, another question here, and then I'll let you go back to your presentation, and I'll save the rest for the Q&A. But we had a question about this person's organization is wanting to update their policies and procedures. Is there a good source to reference to ensure that they include all the federal requirements in policies and procedures?
Well, not to toot my own horn, but we actually have an editable template that you can purchase at MyFedTrainer that covers the different policies and procedures. So I would say that. I mean, honestly, 2 CFR 200 kind of outlines here's the different requirements. It's very, very broad. But I think that there are some pieces here and there. I think that National Grant Management Association has a grant management body of knowledge resource that you could definitely take a look at. But if you're looking for something like that, let me know. I can share a link to it, but we offer it as just because we know people might not be able to develop things from scratch. And so it's something that you can adapt, but that's something that you can decide if that's a resource. But I think the NGMA grant management body of knowledge is a good resource too. So
Thanks, Rachel. And I just put a link in the chat, folks, for myfedtrainer.com where you can find that resource as well as plenty of others that Rachel offers specifically when it comes to federal grant compliance. So take a look at that. And Rachel, I'll let you get back to your presentation now.
sure. And I'm just going to go through part 3. And I think part 4 is some of the challenges. I'll go quickly over them, but because I want to leave room for those questions at the end. So just to give you an understanding, so grant administration agencies by type, you have the awarding agency. They're the ones that issue the notice of grant award. They have the associated personnel assigned, and provide ongoing technical assistance. Now, the difference, a pass-through entity has the same responsibilities, but they're sort of in the middle. So they're sort of a recipient, they have to do the reporting requirements, they have to work with their agency, they have to, meet those specific deliverables, but they're also providing oversight because they're overseeing a subrecipient. So, there's a little bit of dual role there if you are a pass-through entity, and a subrecipient is basically the same as a recipient, in terms of what they're supposed to comply with and how they're supposed to report and stuff like that. And, I always say this, working together is absolutely critical between program finance and operations. Now, I know that every organization is a little bit different, so some of these roles might look a little bit different within your particular entity, but just so you know, like how those kind of things are generally broken out. So we're going to talk about the team. Now, part one is building your team. So this is like when you're putting it together during that phase one, your research and strategic planning, you want to have all of those applicable stakeholders, internal, external, clarify those roles and responsibilities. And, when you're having that sort of kickoff, what are the tracking systems that you're going to use to manage tasks? And how are you going to be putting together that project plan? Remember that maintenance slide, what is it that you're going to be tracking and when, and what is the system or tool that you're going to use, and setting up that meeting schedule and creating specific codes from an accounting vantage that are going to be assigned to that grant. So all of that has to happen at the beginning, and who's going to be doing what, because it's really critical to understand those pieces. And if you want to sort of get an overview, so finance is really doing the budget reconciliation. So, you probably want to do that every month, but at least quarterly, at least to submit those financial reports and comply with all those financial management policies, especially related to allowable costs and safeguarding information and having those internal control policies in place. And also your indirect cost rate, if you do have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement and it is still going to be honored, then ensuring that you have that information in place. And programmatic, this is when we talk about performance measurement, evaluation, just having that information, ongoing collection of the data, and that if there's any individuals that are assigned, that they're doing the time and effort reporting, because that is one of the biggest audit findings. If you're not tracking your time on a regular basis, then that is going to be dinged. And what is your policy regarding that? So and having all those progress. And if there are any shifts with the work that you're doing, that you're communicating that with the other people on that team that's assigned in this step. And operations as well. So those are, just sort of the project oversight and ensuring all the reporting and compliance requirements are done, and just sort of that bridge between programmatic and finance, because sometimes things can get a little tricky between the different teams. And so having an intermediary, especially if it's a large organization, can be helpful. So 2, the notice of grant award terms and conditions. So review those, understand what they are, because if you've looked at a notice of grant award, there's a lot of information in there. And so you want to have an understanding of what the financial and programmatic requirements, even if they don't touch you, even if you don't have a role in that, it's important to at least see that. And if you do have a role as a project manager, know who should be pulled in and when. And also see when you look at those requirements, if there's anything that you need to do to build up your policies, to ensure that you have the right capacity to provide support in specific areas, and making improvements, because sometimes there might be some adjustments that are made. And always reach out to the agency if you have specific questions regarding any of those terms. Step 3, this is my favorite. Learn more about 2 CFR 200 if you manage federal grants, and if not just 2 CFR 200, it could be other requirements as well. Because if you receive funding through a pass-through entity such as a state agency, you have to adhere to those requirements too. And those could be added on to 2 CFR, an extra layer. So knowing what those requirements are and reviewing the statutory information is going to be helpful for you to know, what you have to do and if there's going to be any modifications that need to be made to your policies or reporting information. So that's something I just think is really critical. And I think, 2 CFR 200 is quite lengthy. I don't suggest that you read it in detail. But there is, a table of contents and just knowing, what the specific sections are. There's sections on procurement, there's core definitions, there's section on, terminations, there's a lot of different information in there that might be relevant. So just knowing that it's there and that you can use it as a resource in case you need to look up some information is really critical, especially if you are concerned about some kind of non-compliant situation. You want to do that before there could be potential funding removal. And step 4, this is the ongoing meeting. So this is when, after you've kind of started working through this, what is it that you are doing to, you know, ensure that the information sharing and the collaboration is happening? How is finance sharing any updates on, hey, we were supposed to spend X amount on this. How, are we making those purchases? And are these procurements happening? And we're seeing this kind of shift. And on the program side, it's to educate on here. We're seeing we're actually serving more people than we thought we would. Maybe we want to notify the program officer or, other shifts that might be happening. We had this change in key personnel. We need to notify the funding office so that we can, make those adjustments and provide their CV. So there's things like that that you want to have those regular meetings. And again, the cadence of those meetings is really going to vary. It could be weekly to start and then go to bi-weekly and then monthly. I always say there's a lot of work at the beginning, but then once you're in maintenance mode, it can kind of ease up. So it's about coming together and figuring out as a team what works best. And sometimes it could be a virtual check-in, but it's just about that information sharing and how you're sharing the details about the award and, if there's any adjustments that need to be made. And here's just an overview of some of those like administration tasks, like data quality. Again, that goes back to evaluation, financial oversight and integrity. This is more of like the ethical part of funding management, financial management. And, this is financial then and communication should be for all, but, I know that operations can help kind of foster that dialogue. And then also we have preparedness. And so putting together that project plan, cultivation. So if there are questions, sort of that ongoing relationship building and document maintenance. So it's important to keep those files. It's a requirement to keep those records for at least 3 years upon closure of the federal award, but it could be longer if there's some litigation or there could be other specific requirements. I know ARPA funding needs to be kept on file for 5 years. And so, and that information is also critical if you have a single audit and then, your funder might request something in the future. So step 5, what is your process for ongoing support and maintenance? Just thinking about, how can you perhaps codify this? Can be put into job descriptions? Is this something that, leadership can help with trainings and also record keeping? So all of those things as part of maintenance, what is your leadership team doing to ensure that you are going to remain a good steward of federal funding and building out that culture of compliance? So it's really about the tracking. It's about the continued support for keeping records and relevant information as needed. So, using the appropriate systems that, as I said, there's no one size fits all approach, but just what works best for you. So part 4, I'm going to quickly go through these before we open it up for questions. Challenge 1, I get this a lot. What happens if I don't have a large grant department? And I'd love to see if some people want to share what they think. Let's see. Lots of meetings with program staff. Focus on likely winners. Yep. Yep. It's a challenge. Yep. Yep. Automatic reminders and pre-scheduled meetings. It's a challenge. And so the thing about compliance is that there has to be a segregation of duties. That's one of the internal control requirements for federal funding. So first you need to have that sort of core responsibilities. What is it that you need to accomplish, and can those be broken up into different segments? And also see if additional support can be needed, because sometimes managing a grant takes a lot of work and you might need some additional support. And grants can support those positions. So you can include those as part of your budget, as long as you adhere to the appropriate procurement requirements. And go back to your strategic plan to decide if capacity building is needed. Do you need to hire more people to meet these different priorities if you do receive a lot of big federal grants or other types of grants? So these are just some considerations, but I know it's a challenge with smaller shops, but just, you know, it can be, yeah, something to consider in the future. My supervisor, and I actually had a client that said this, doesn't believe that grant compliance is important. So what I say is that show them a copy of your notice of grant award and the required responsibilities. And also, if you receive if you expend over $1 million in your fiscal year in federal grants, and that can be across federal grants, and you have to adhere to the single audit requirements. And so show them the compliance supplement and say, here's the things that we need to adhere to. And talk about the pitfalls. Like, there's disallowed costs, legal consequences, debarment, suspension, and why it's so important that federal grants are such a different beast from others, because it's the rules that need to be followed. So just because you were able to skate by before without putting these measures in place does not mean it's going to work now. We're in a very different environment. And so I think stressing that is really important. And so the last one, we're preparing for our first single audit. What should we do? Look at the single audit compliance supplement. You can Google it. It's on the OMB website, and they update it each year. For each different program, it outlines what you need to do to adhere to those requirements, and talk about it with your team to ensure that you have the record keeping, that you're documenting the information, you're keeping things on file, emails, relevant procurement information, reports, all of the things that are related to the administration of that grant award. And then talk as a team to maybe do like a pre-single audit so that you can be in good shape, and have those written policies and procedures. So here's just like the plan of action in just a sort of a process flow. So review that notice of funding opportunity, ensure that you have the capacity to manage a grant. And then if you do get the funding, use the Kipling method to evaluate, your stakeholders and the different kind of gaps that could be there if you don't have a robust culture of compliance. And then if you do get the award, review that notice of grant award with your team and other stakeholders, conduct regular meetings, have a system in place to measure, and then you could be ready for closeout and record keeping and bookkeep and reporting. And so with that, I'm going to leave it for any questions. And I do have a risk assessment handout that I can share with Nia after this, but that's something that can help you sort of evaluate. So yeah, and with that, let's see what other questions we have.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
On.
I'm gonna give you I'm gonna give you a 1 minute breather. So folks, if you have any last minute questions, drop them in the chat. I'll go through there in about 30 seconds. I'll let Rachel catch her breath. And in the meantime, I promised you all a special instrumental offer, so I'll share that right now before we dive into our Q&A. For any of our first timers in the room, Rachel alluded to this, but Instrumentl is a grant solution that can help you stay on top of all of your opportunities. You can find funders, but you can also manage your post-award requirements. One of the things that I think is really helpful, especially as we're speaking about this topic is that Instrumental has some really neat solutions in the post award phase, including automatic deadline updates and alerts, so you never miss a deadline. Your collaboration becomes easier because you can assign tasks across team members. And you'll be able to stay on top of grant budgets with automated spend down tracking and forecasting. You can also integrate your calendar, so whatever you do on Instrumental can also be synced with Outlook or Google Calendar. And in addition to the grant database and those management tools, you can monitor grant metrics and have a quick way to report back on impact to your leadership or board. So, if you want to try out any of those features or you just want to dive into our grant database, you can use this special link that I just put in the chat. This is only going to be valid for the next couple of days, so make sure you get that free trial started. What's special about that link is it lets you dive into Instrumental without having to meet with one of our onboarding strategists. Usually, you do have to hop on a call with one of our strategists just so you can get a lay of the land. But because you've walked through Instrumental with us right here, this special link lets you skip that. So save that and make sure you get that started this week if you want to take advantage of that. So with that, I'm going to hop into our Q&A and pull up some of the questions that we have here for Rachel. So one of the questions we got was, can we get your RACI chart in an Excel or some sort of replicable format?
Oh, I found that online. So I bet you if you just look up racy chart in Google, I'm sure you can find one. I know it's a great resource because you can use it for a lot of different things. But I'm sure you can replicate it pretty easy or find one there. That's how I did it. So,
Yeah, and we did have somebody in the chat earlier put in a link for some racy charts there. So it's definitely a resource that you can find online for free, and you can find one that works for your needs. One question that we just got, and I think this is a really important one to address. Therese asks, they're trying to learn what's needed for federal grants. They need to upload an audit, and the organization says it's just too expensive, and that essentially lets them not even apply for federal grants. Do you have any advice on where you could get that, what it would cost, sort of the process around obtaining that if you've never had one before?
you definitely there has to be, I mean, each state, I know that again, I've connected with the Greater Washington Society of CPAs. So within your community, you must have like a state or local CPA chapter, and that could be a great way to kind of find out, accounting resources who could do that, because there are accountants who won't touch it, might not work with nonprofits, and there are others that do. So I definitely think that's a good place to start. Is it like the AICPA? I feel like that's the umbrella organization, and I think they have chapters all over. So that's what I would suggest, because it might be more helpful to, yeah, to communicate with them, because I know, yeah, that it can be pricey, but it's just also how much do you want to invest in it? How much is that going to help you with your larger efforts? And that's something that you as an organization will have to decide. But I do know that if you want to get some of the bigger dollars, then that is something that they will look for to ensure financial stability.
Therese is adding a follow-up there. They say that they were told about 28K for an audit. Does that sound right? Is that sort of a ballpark? Is there a ballpark that we should be looking for as a realistic number?
Oh, I'm probably not the best person to ask for that, because I mean, there's a difference in, if you're talking about just regular financial audit versus single audit, again, I would just speak with the AICPA chapter, because I'm not sure if I get into that kind of nitty-gritty with clients, because usually they already have audits, and so it's a little bit different when they come to me. So.
For sure. And we have Maggie in the chat who's suggesting, Therese, that you talk to somebody else, maybe another firm, get separate quotes and compare it that way. Maggie points out that audits are required for a lot of other grants. Cole says that that does sound about right. So, folks, if you have any experience with audits in the chat, let us know in the comments. We can help each other out that way because that is a very, it's a pricey investment up front, right?
Mhm.
Rachel, another question we had was from Tammy. This was early on in the presentation, but Tammy was wondering if you have any suggestions. You spoke to this a little bit in your presentation, but if you have any suggestions for tracking time and effort and how maybe your firm stays on top of everything that needs to be done and also has been done in the process.
And this is another thing that it really depends on the organization. So for instance, when I was starting out in compliance, almost 20 years ago, we were going to schools, and I was working with a charter school company, and we were actually getting paper copies and having them sign off on it. There are fortunately better processes. So I would say you probably have to complete maybe some kind of electronic timesheet. And so I think that that's the best way to do that because you want to allocate that percentage. So if you are designated as 30% on a federal grant, they just want to see that you're being consistent and then having somebody else sign off on it, not you, because that's again, conflict of interest there if you're signing off and doing the timesheet. So I would say that speaking with somebody in finance and looking at your, the timesheet process that you might already have or anything that can track some kind of time that could be maybe associated with the accounting system of record. There are a few different systems that you can use and not one is better than the other. It's just about maintaining that, having good reporting capacity and being able to, and some people might just have like those tracking sheets. It might just be a spreadsheet, which is fine too.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. That's going to bring us almost to the top of the hour. So I want to respect everyone's time and leave enough room to shout out all of the places that you can connect with Rachel. So I'm going to put some links here in the chat. I really encourage you all to follow Rachel on LinkedIn. She has been our go to resource as we're looking to see what breaking news are coming out of the White House. So I really encourage Rachel's LinkedIn. You can also take advantage of some of the resources offered through MyFedTrainer and, of course, connect with Rachel's firm, RBW Strategy. Rachel, if there's anything else you want to shout out, please feel free.
Just best of luck and just if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I always answer emails, so.
Thank you, Rachel. And I promised you all two helpful resources. I'm going to share both of these in the chat. There you go. You should have both links. So the first one is an agency-specific update spreadsheet. So that's going to be the status on grants being issued by that federal agency because it is all different agency to agency. The second one is going to be an overview of the state of federal funding that includes a helpful trigger words list. So feel free to go through those resources and see if there's any useful pieces of information for you. As you exit this webinar, you are going to be prompted to fill out a feedback form. We really appreciate everybody who does that because it helps us know what future events you want to see. It helps us plan out our upcoming programs as well. So please take a second to do that. And we would love to see you at our upcoming events. Both of these that you see on the screen here are coming up next week. So I would love to see you all at those. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. For those of you who came on Thursday as well, thanks for coming to both. It was great to have you. Hopefully, you got some good intel from Rachel. And Rachel, thank you again for everything you've provided to our Instrumentl community over the past month and a half. We're really in this together, and we really appreciate your generosity and all of the insights that you share with us.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. And good luck to everybody. And we'll get through this.